Cheryl Roberts is an attorney and a former local judge from Columbia County. Early in her career, she served as a counsel to committees in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. She has been a speechwriter, a lobbyist, and most recently served as Corporation Counsel for the City of Hudson. She is currently Executive Director of the Greenburger Center, which is part and parcel of today's talk. So without wasting any more time, here is Cheryl Roberts.
Thank you so much, Fred and Don and all of you. I'm really honored to be here and looking forward to this conversation, which I hope it will become. Every time I give a presentation about the Greenburger Center's work, I learn a lot from the people that I'm talking with. So I've heard a little bit about some of your backgrounds, and I'm just excited to talk with you today. So just one quick update on my bio. I'm actually, in addition to being the Executive Director of the Greenburger Center, I am again serving as the Corporation Counsel for the City of Hudson. So it's a little bit overwhelming, but you know, the mayor that was just elected in Hudson in January is the first African-American and the youngest in the city's history. His name is Kamal Johnson. He's 35 years old. And he came in with a platform for criminal justice reform and housing reform. And I just could not say no. And I'm really proud to say that in Hudson, we are really, I think, ahead of many governments in the region in trying to reform, especially after George Floyd's death, the way we police in Hudson. So I might suggest that at some point you might want to hear from Kamal Johnson too. He's really inspiring and a wave of the new generation, I think, at what is to come. So the Greenburger Center, I'm going to try very hard to share my screen now. My daughter taught me last night, so we're going to try this. Just one second.
So on the bottom of the page,
yep.
there should be a share screen button.
Yeah.
You've got a window that will pop up.
Yep, I think I got it.
Now you need to run the slideshow.
Do you all see that?
Yes, you did wonderful.
Okay, so I'm successful as far as I'm concerned.
You had a great teacher that you taught well.
Thank you very much. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about mass incarceration in the United States, and I want to focus mostly on the criminalization of people with mental illness and substance use disorders, and then we'll talk a little bit about Hope House on Crotona Park, which is a project of the Greenburger Center that really came out of a very personal commitment from the founder's own experience with his own son. Let's get started here. So for those who don't have some of the background, I thought I would just give the big picture. The US has 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoners. We incarcerate a greater percentage of our population than any country on earth, which is really not something to be proud of. The National Research Council in 2014 took a look at why, who and why this was happening. So again, on a kind of a macro level, in 1973, we had about 200,000 people incarcerated. Of course, the population has grown since then, but still by 2009, we had 2.2 million incarcerated, and that's about where it stands right now. We incarcerate 1 in 100 people, which is, as it says here, 5 to 10 times higher than Western Europe or other democracies. And the growth of incarceration report that the National Research Council put out is really an exhaustive study on the issue with some phenomenal academics and policy folks, and I encourage you, if you're really interested, to take a look at it. So who is being incarcerated? The council found that it was largely people coming from disadvantaged segments of the population. They comprise mainly minority men under 40, poorly educated, and often carrying additional deficits like drug and alcohol addiction, mental and physical illness, and they lack work preparation. So what are the causes? There were several causes, but they distilled it down to this one single proximate cause. not being a rise in crime rates, but the policy choices made by legislators to greatly increase the use of imprisonment as a response to crime. Mandatory prison sentences, intensified enforcement of drug laws, long sentences, all contributed to the high rates of incarceration, but also especially to extraordinary rates of incarceration in Black and Latino communities. So, I would say that we have made those policy choices, and they're being made on our behalf. And it's more like they say the policy choices than it is the people. The population that's being incarcerated is not inherently criminal. Rather, I would submit that it's really the policies at times that are criminal. And as an example, I want to show you a quote that every time I give a presentation and I read this quote, I never get used to this quote. It's from John Ehrlichman. And it's really where the drug law, war on drugs started with the Nixon. People associate with Reagan, but it was really President Nixon. And John Ehrlichman said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this policy has had a disproportionate impact on Black men. You can see this is from the Prison Policy Initiative, another great source of information on mass incarceration. And the average American, African-American man has a 32% chance of being incarcerated. It's unacceptable, and I'm sure that all of us who are not African-American would not tolerate a 32% chance if their son or daughter could be in their lifetime incarcerated. I think, unfortunately, though, what the National Council and others have, at least in 2014, not really recognized was that in addition to the policies around drug laws and sentencing laws, there were also policies around people with mental illness. And we have, over the same time period, actually criminalized mental illness and substance use disorders. Today, of the 2.2 million people incarcerated, about half live with a mental illness, and more than 70% of incarcerated women have mental illness. Overall, about 20% have serious mental illness. I actually think that number is probably higher. A lot of the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that you read on the level of SMI in prisons, for some inexplicable reason, they always seem to leave out the people who are actually outside the prison walls and are in what are called forensic hospitals because they are so ill they can't be managed in the prison system. And those people are often left out. So I suspect that this number is higher. Today, unfortunately, someone with a serious mental illness is 10 times more likely to be in jail or prison than in a psychiatric hospital. I actually, just this morning, I'm preparing for another panel tomorrow, and I saw that a judge in Florida who's nationally recognized cites this as actually 25 times more likely to be in jail and prison. And I'm not quite sure if that's just in Miami-Dade where he's from or if it's nationally. I need to find out. But at least you have a 10 times more chance to be in a prison than a psychiatric hospital. So how did we get here? This starts really back in the 1950s and 60s. So this is, of course, John Kennedy. John Kennedy came into office in 1960. In 1955, we kind of hit our apex of psychiatric hospital beds. At that time, we had about 560 psychiatric hospital beds for a population of about 165 million people. John Kennedy felt very strongly about this issue. Of course, his sister Rosemary had mental illness. It's unclear to me what she had, but it was said that she was prone to outbursts. And in 1941, her father authorized at the age of 23 her lobotomy. And unfortunately, it didn't go well, and she spent the rest of her life in a Catholic home for disturbed or disabled children. Because of that, John Kennedy enacted something called the Mental Illness and Community, the Community Health Act. And in 1963, it was the last law that he actually signed into effect. And it was intended to channel more money into community-based preventative care and treatment, and to go away from what had come to be seen as kind of snake pits of asylums. So that was the goal. I think it was a worthwhile, worthy goal, but unfortunately the Vietnam War came along, and a lot of the funding that had been set aside went to the Vietnam War. And then with the faltering economy in the 60s and 70s, the program that he envisioned was never adequately funded. Unfortunately, then came Medicaid, which was terrific for some physical illnesses, but not so much for mental illnesses. You see Lady Bird Johnson there. You'll see in the next slide her husband signing the Medicaid law in 1965. And this is when the government said, well, we will help pay for the physical health needs of poor people, but we are not going to fund for the psychological or psychiatric needs. And they specifically said they were not going to fund any beds in what are called IMDs, institutions of mental disease, that are larger than 16 beds. And the theory was, well, if we don't fund with our Medicaid dollars larger institutions, then they'll never be able to get scale. They'll never have these asylums again. And, you know, we will let the states deal with these issues in another way. The problem is asylums never really went away. They just really morphed into two types. We have jails and prisons, as you'll see in a moment, and places like Austin Riggs and Silver Hill, where the very wealthy can afford to have that kind of care. But this Medicaid provision, the IMD rule, has been extraordinarily damaging and is in large part responsible for why we don't have quality psychiatric institutions for poor people. It is the only Social Security provision that discriminates against someone based upon their illness. So if you have brain cancer or some other physical cancer in your head, you will probably find a bed in a hospital. If you have schizophrenia in your head, you will, if you're not wealthy enough to afford inpatient residential long-term care or have other resources, you may very well find yourself in a prison, jail, or homeless. So here is President Johnson signing that law, and not surprisingly, within about 10 years, homelessness begins to rise. By 1978, it's really becoming a problem, and in between 1987 and 97, the number of homeless people in state shelters doubled, and in some cases tripled. 1980, President Carter actually saw this as a problem, and he enacted the Mental Health Systems Act. And it was meant to deal with this chronic mental illness and the population that was really affected. But in 1981, President Reagan was elected, and he passed or signed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Bill. And this bill really shifted the funding that President Carter had put into the system away from specific programs for that population, and rather block granted the money to states. And I think President Reagan's notion was, well, the states can figure out how best to spend this money. Unfortunately, the money was not spent on the people who really needed the money the most. And we can all theorize why. In some sense, I think it had to do with this population not being very, very politically active and not voting. It's changed a lot. The parents of people with SMI, serious mental illness, have really organized around the country for decades now, and things are changing slowly, but the states did not put the money where I believe it was most needed. So the problem just really continued to get worse. And by the 1990s, you were seeing psychiatric beds used for the forensic or the criminal justice involved population that were found incompetent to stand trial or not guilty by reason of insanity. By 2005, actually the year that Rosemary Kennedy died, there was really a crisis in mental health beds. We only had about 50,000 beds for a population that was now 292 million, and experts concluded that we really should have around 146,000 beds to deal with a population this size. By 2014, the transinstitutionalization is really complete. You have people, who had years ago been in a psychiatric facility, now in prisons and jails. About the same number had been trans-institutionalized. We only have now about 35,000 beds. I think that number is actually lower, but the population is 322. Now, it's not that simple, really. There were certainly other factors for why there's been this huge shift from psychiatric facilities to prisons and jails for this population. It also has to do with the war on drugs. This population also has often a co-occurring substance use disorder. And so they are caught up in, the drug war, just like several other populations. And also the sentencing has affected this population as well. So mental illness has really, when it gets to be untreated and out of control and there's no other help, unfortunately becomes a police problem. And as you can see from this slide, the risk of being killed by a police officer for a person with untreated mental illness is 16 times greater than that of people who are approached or stopped otherwise. Just a little background here. People with mental illness are no more, serious mental illness, are no more typically violent than anyone else. In fact, they're less violent and often the victims of crime, except in certain circumstances. And that is when they are untreated. And it seems as though people with schizophrenia can be more violent if they're untreated, and particularly those that have delusions or who are psychotic. But other than that, people with mental illness really are not, violent. So group therapy in prison, so as I said, we have kind of two asylums. One for most people that are poor end up being prison or jail. And prison and jail is just not the place that you want to be probably ever, but certainly not when you have mental illness. It's hard to get privacy when you want to have a therapy session. Group therapy, it's absurd to see this picture, at least to me. You may not be able to get your medications on time, and the formularies in jails and prisons are not even always, they're just not what you can get on the outside. So even if you have a medication that somehow worked on the outside, once you go in, you may not be able to get that exact drug. So there's a whole lot of reasons why this is not the right place to get treatment. The next slide is a little bit, it's a little gruesome. So I just want to give a little warning about that. This is the reality of what it's like for people with serious mental illness in prison. The man in blue on the top left, Paul Schlosser, had a history of mental illness. He was not, complying with the rules, and so he was extracted from his cell. And extraction happens when an incarcerated person, especially people with mental illness, are in their cell and they're not cuffing up, they're not turning around to put their hands where an officer can cuff them. They're not, complying. They may be throwing feces, they may be throwing urine. And Paul was doing some of that. And so they extracted him and strapped him in a chair. And then he was saying something to the officer. I watched the video, and the officer sprayed this mace in his face. This is mace for crowd control, not to be used within 18 inches of someone's face. Paul survived, but he ended up suing. I don't know the outcome, but this is in Maine. On the next slide to the right, the man in blue is also being extracted. And sometimes when you're on suicide watch, you have no clothes, no blankets, nothing. So this man, Charlton Chrisman, had a long history of mental illness and a substance use disorder. He was extracted, he was shackled, he had a spit hood put over him, and he died shortly later in a Virginia prison. On the bottom, you see just a close-up of someone getting so-called group therapy. And then the last picture is Mr. Lopez, Christopher Lopez in Colorado. He had spent 90 days in solitary confinement. By the way, the UN lists solitary confinement as a form of torture. He was extracted from his cell as unresponsive. He had been suffering for a long time in his cell and he wouldn't respond. I watched the video. Because he actually had a physical condition, he was seated and shackled and spit hood was put over his head and he was left to die. He had low blood sodium levels, and he died in his chair just a few hours after this shot was taken. This is not acceptable. This is not what our country is about. I would submit this is worse than any asylum that was, and it's being done in our name. The Virginia pilot did a study of 400 deaths. 41% had died in isolation or had recently been in isolation, that's solitary confinement. 44 deaths were by suicide of the 400. 70 cases, the people had been tasered or stun gunned before or used with pepper spray before dying. 11% of the time, family and friends had tried to warn of their loved one's needs and tried to bring, in 6 cases, medication to the jail, which was refused. And the study found that it was not uncommon for such individuals to wind up in isolation, naked and smearing feces around their cell. So that's the reality. And at the Greenburger Center, we're trying to change at least some of that for this kind of deep end of the pool population. So this is Morgan and Francis Greenburger. Morgan was incarcerated. He has a mental illness. He'd really been showing signs since he was 4 years old. Francis Greenburger is a very successful real estate developer in New York City. For those of you who know Columbia County, he has a second home up here, and he founded Art Only. Maybe some of you have been there 25, 30 years ago. Francis was a very engaged father and did everything he could, but Morgan still ended up in jail. And I want to tell you a little bit about, and actually prison, a little bit about his story to give you a sense of why we formed the Greenburger Center and what we're trying to do. So Morgan was on a street in New York, close to his father's office, but he found himself with no money in his pocket. He met a newfound friend, and they decided to go uptown with a cab. So they ended up robbing the cab and getting caught. And Morgan, and this is very characteristic of Morgan's impulse control issues and his manicness. And so he was bailed out by his father. And while he was out on bail, he became paranoid that drug dealers were after him because he also has a substance use disorder. So he called the police and asked if they would come over. They came over and they came into his apartment, and they saw his African-American and Hispanic caregiver, her friend, and they assumed that they were the drug dealers. So they handcuffed them and then went upstairs to find Morgan and realized that there were no drug dealers after him, that he was just in a state. So they left the apartment, unhandcuffed his caregivers, and left Morgan there. Morgan decided that if the police couldn't help him, then maybe the firemen could. So he took some garbage from his trash and put it on his kitchen stove, lighted the fire, and lit the fire, and watched it burn and called the fire department. When the fire department came, they asked him if he knew someone was in the house. And he said, he knew that his caregivers were downstairs. There had been no damage. The fire was put out, and he was then arrested for arson. And because he knew someone was downstairs, it was a violent felony, arson. So Morgan spent 2.5 years at Rikers Island before he was eventually sent upstate through a plea agreement. He had hoped and tried, his father had tried for 2 years to get him diverted to an alternative to incarceration where he could receive treatment instead of going to prison, because everyone knew that he would most likely get worse in prison, not better. We found a facility for Morgan, but the DA wouldn't accept the placement. And mostly it had to do with if Morgan went to this facility and decided to leave, he would have left, and the service provider would have had to call the court and get a bench warrant to then have Morgan arrested. So it was that lag time that really concerned the DA. And so Morgan ended up taking a plea to 5 years and spent another 2 years upstate. And this photo is taken in an upstate prison. Morgan eventually got out, and in 2014, we decided, Francis and I, to start the Greenburger Center for Social and Criminal Justice to do two things. One was to figure out an alternative to incarceration that would actually be acceptable to a DA and a judge and provide treatment to this population. The second was to advocate on behalf of people in Morgan's situation so that eventually we could put our model that we developed out of business, and so that they could be diverted from the outset and not be in the incarceration, in the criminal justice system at all. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about now Hope House on Crotona Park. It's the model that we developed. We're not open yet. We hope to break ground after 6 years. We hope to break ground in the fall, but of course with COVID, I really, I don't know what's going to happen. We're hoping to break ground, and we also have some regulatory issues to work out with that IMD exclusion that I mentioned, several slides ago. So just a little bit about Hope House, and I'll show you some pictures of it. Hope House is designed as an alternative to incarceration for a long-term residential stay for this population. So you have to have a serious mental illness and a felony level charge, a higher level charge to go to Hope House. It has to be voluntary. You have to know what's happening. You have to agree voluntarily to go and have to demonstrate that you're competent to make that decision. And then you have to ask for bail. So we are going to deal with that issue, that time lag issue I spoke of earlier, by using bond agency authority to provide security. So in our case, the defendant will say, Judge, I would like you to set nominal bail. There's provision in the bail law that allows a defendant to ask for nominal bail. As a judge, I allowed this to go forward. Oftentimes when a defendant had let's say a higher level charge, they thought they might go to state prison. But there was a plea agreement being worked out. So the defendant would ask for nominal bail. You'd set $1 bail. They'd sit in local jail while the deal was worked out, and then the deal would actually be for time served. So that at the end of the 3 or 4, whatever months, the DA and the defense counsel would agree to a misdemeanor, a lower level charge for time served. And then at that point, the defendant would get out and not have to serve time in a prison. So that same nominal bail provision will be used here. The defendant will say, Judge, please set bail on me. The bail will be set, will be paid for basically by the Greenburger Center. And that will allow the Greenburger Center to use the bond agent as security. So in New York State, when I'm a bond agent as well, if I bail you out and you do something to threaten the terms of your release, if the judge says you're going to go to Hope House, you're going to stay there for 2 years, you're going to abide by all the rules, you're going to not be violent, and you don't do those things, the person who bailed you out can take you back into custody right there and bring you back to court. So there's no need for that warrant from the court that we spoke about earlier. So that's really what makes Hope House different. And I got this idea from a few different sources, but I think the easiest way to explain this is if you're very wealthy, especially in the federal system, you can be out pre-trial, oftentimes with a guard posted outside your apartment door in the city. And it occurred to me that poor people should be able to have the same opportunity. So by basically creating a home-like environment where you can get treatment, and the treatment is brought to you, and we have security guards, in this case, bond agents on staff, if we need them, then we are basically providing that home-like environment with some security so that the judges and the DAs feel comfortable about sending someone who admittedly has been charged with a violent felony, and the person can get treatment, and hopefully society can save money and be safer in the end. So that's Hope House in a nutshell. These are two buildings in Crotona Park. The one on the left, as you're looking at the screen, was a men's shelter. We purchased it in public auction. The one on the right was privately held, and they asked if we would purchase it when we purchased the sister building. So we purchased both, and we've been trying to, one way or another, connect these buildings or separately, or to create our Hope House model in these buildings. I'll just say one thing about the location. The last place I wanted to cite was in the Bronx, because the Bronx has its fair share and more, actually much more, of uses like this. They do have the highest incarceration rate of all the 5 boroughs, but I really wanted to stay away. But for a lot of reasons, we ended up here. And the first thing we did was to go to the community board and say, here's what we want to do. We want to have people with higher level felony charges and serious mental illness, SMI, in your community, but we won't stay here if you don't want us here. We engaged in an 8-month conversation with them, and in the end, they approved us on 2 conditions. One was they didn't want anyone accused of a sex offense in this facility because the little red building right next door is used for an after-school day program. I, of course, said, I understand that, that is okay. The second thing they wanted was 4 beds reserved for people from the Bronx, and I thought that was incredibly appropriate, and of course we said yes to that too. So, and they've been sticking through all the changes we've had to make on our plans the whole way. So this is what Hope House 1 will look like if we can break ground in the fall. It's a 5-story building. It will be for 16 people because of that IMD exclusion issue. We'll see if we do a Hope House 2 next door in the future. Again, just a little bit of background on Hope House. It will serve 16 people, 8 men and 8 women. Clients will not be able to leave except with the bond agent or security staff and with permission. As I mentioned, they will have to have an SMI and charged with a felony. And they basically have to understand what's happening and not be eligible to go to any other diversion program, because if they are, they should go. Hope House is only for people who have no other options like Morgan Greenburger. The residential and clinical program will have residential and security staff 24 hours a day. It will be a trauma-informed modified therapeutic community with basically what's called a clubhouse work order day overlay. So we can get into more of this if you want in the question and answers. Happy to talk about this. There'll also be clinical staff available, and we'll have evidence-based therapeutic and substance use services available too. So these are the people who support. There's a longer list than this, but here's a sampling of people who support Hope House on Crotona Park. And we just hope that we can break ground on this project in the fall. If you'd like to follow what we're doing, here's our website. And you can learn more about Hope House, and you can sign up for our mailing list. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, I think. How's that? And there you have it. I think you're muted. I'm not here.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Cheryl. I don't have any questions yet, but I'm sure I'm going to ask a couple. I have a couple for you.
Sure.
First, was the quote you had from Ehrlichman early on. In what setting did he make that?
I believe he made it after, several decades after, when he was older. He was being interviewed, I think.
Okay.
I don't know if it was televised live or not, but I read it first in a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. And if you haven't read that book, it's just, I think everyone in high school should read that book. It should be reading. And I would encourage you to read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
Okay, we do have one question from Benjamin Wang, who asked if you can discuss the prison industrial complex a bit.
Which part of the complex would you like to talk about? I mean, it's definitely there.
Benjamin, can you unmute yourself and expand on your question? He doesn't have a mic, so I guess he would.
I don't have a mic. Can I type it in?
Can he
Sure.
type it in? Yeah, so go right ahead. So we eagerly await Benjamin's deep thoughts. Important stuff.
While he's typing, I can tell you a couple of the things. Just in general, you know, like I mentioned, I'm a bond agent, and I did until recently do pro bono bond work for the Columbia County Bail Fund. We've actually, fortunately, just are in the process of closing down because we're really not needed anymore. But all of them, but I'm just going to say 90% of the people that I bailed out as a bond agent over the 2.5 years that we were in operation had either a substance use disorder or a mental illness. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's really no place for people with either.
I have another question for you, Cheryl, while we're at it. You know, what you're doing with Hope House, it's very impressive plans. Not only physical plan, but what you're planning for treatment or services there. Obviously, funding is a big issue, and I'm curious how you're pursuing that, and are you getting any grants from the state, or I would say federal, but that's probably a cause I'm not going to go to.
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest reasons why it's taken so long, because of the IMD exclusion and other Medicaid rules. It really is a challenge. So we have been getting grants to develop it from the City of New York. They are, you know, committed to going forward and paying for some of it. We still do have a funding gap. So some of it will come from city, what's called discretionary member item from the City Council. Some will come from congregate care, SSI basically. Some will come from the clinic Medicaid, which we can get, but the residential Medicaid, which is about a $550,000 nut, it is the issue right now. It's the gap. We have legislation pending in the legislature to help address that issue. We also have something called a Medicaid waiver pending with the federal government to try and close that gap, but that's certainly an issue. So you're right to point it out.
It's curious. Okay, but you are pursuing. Sherry had a question. She wants to speak.
I just don't talk to people lately. It's just so exciting. I want to thank you for your good presentation. I had a couple of questions, but first I wanted to say that I think people with mental illness and personality disorders sometimes, you know, and it certainly speaks to the police, but sometimes it's environmentally or socially triggered if, you know, people are not addressed appropriately. There are certainly things that can be done to exacerbate issues. I'm not familiar with what a spit hood is, and the Hope House, it looked like there were bars on the window. Was that accurate?
The spit hood is the hood that used to go over Mr. Lopez's head. I'm not sure. It's like a netting, and it's so they don't spit fluids while they're, you know. Yes.
Does it cover your eyes as well?
No, it's clear. It's like a mesh.
Okay.
So he had it on in the last, you know, the last individual had the spit hood on. So I guess you didn't, you know, probably see it, but it's like wearing a netting over your head. So the other question was about the bars. Yes, that version I think does have had bars. And we probably will have some bars. I mean, most, especially in the neighborhood, most of the residences along that on the first floor have bars, just because there's some bit of crime in that neighborhood to begin with. People will also be wearing ankle bracelets in the facility as clients. So there definitely is a level of security in this facility that is not typical of other ATIs, alternative to incarcerations, and that's because this population, you know, it warrants it initially, at least, and they are not getting out of prison now. There's no alternative for them, so we had to provide some extra seatbelts.
Thank you.
Okay, Benjamin typed this question in, so I have that for you, Cheryl.
Okay.
Benjamin wrote, "From what I have learned, we have a prison system that is reaping huge profits from incarceration. The shocking stats that you read to us in the beginning are a result of this, and those who are profiting do not have a lot of reason to change or reform this kind of system.
Yeah, that's true. I guess the one good thing about New York is that, not one good thing, but a good thing about New York is that we don't allow private prisons. Certainly in states where there are private prisons, there's certainly, I think, a profit motive there that doesn't exist here. Having said that, I need to track down, there was a report I recently read about how much it costs. It's in the billions, what it costs families and loved ones every year to support their loved ones in terms of commissary and phone, and it's very expensive just to make a phone call in many states and in many prisons. So yeah, it's you know, the poorest people are, and their families are saddled with these incredible fees. I know when I was a judge, the state tacked on, I don't know, I think it was $135 fee for every ticket at that time, maybe a little bit lower, but there were huge fees, and it all went to, you know, the government's coffers, and a lot of people were not able to afford it.
Understand. Okay, so I have another question. Now we're getting some questions in. People are warming up. Andy asked, New York State has cleared out and closed many of its mental hospitals in favor of community treatment. Should the hospitals be reopened? I know personally, Office of Mental Health operated many facilities that have since basically been closed and are being converted to other issues. Is that, I think that's part of what Andy's talking about, but what's your opinion about should those be reopened?
I think we need to have a new model. I'm not sure, no one wants to go back to necessarily the huge psychiatric hospitals and the way things were run, but I do think that we need to have some longer term beds. I mean, the truth is, like I said before, there are two types of asylums in this country: prisons and jails for poor people, and Austin Riggs and Silver Hill and, you know, other places for the wealthy people. And we need to have an in-between that provides high quality. It shouldn't be, I don't think, 135 people, 200 people. You know, the psychiatrists I've talked to think that, you know, 35, 60, something like that in different wings might be more appropriate. But we definitely need something, because the reality is there are people who need long-term care that can't manage, and they're homeless or in prisons and jails.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question from Sherry. That's actually two parts, two questions. So first, what is a forensic hospital? And second, is Four Winds Ellis Hospital not adequate regarding the numbers, or is it simply not geared for long-term use?
A forensic is basically psychiatric services within the criminal justice system. So a forensic hospital is a hospital where you get psychiatric treatment for the incarcerated population. I don't know the details of Four Winds, actually. I know they have residential care and day programming. I don't think they take a forensic population. And, you know, in terms of whether they can help with preventing people from coming into the criminal justice system, yeah, I think probably we need more Four Winds that are affordable for people who have lower incomes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question, a follow-up from Benjamin Wang about, you're talking about private prisons. And Benjamin asked, if New York doesn't have private prisons, how do our results compare with states that do have private prisons?
I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, Benjamin, in terms of our results, in terms of recidivism rates or the number of people who are incarcerated, but no matter what you're asking, I actually don't know how private prisons compare to our public prisons, really on any factor. So I'm sorry about that. I learned something. I'm gonna have to go and figure this out now. But every time I do, I learn.
To follow up on Andrew's or Benjamin's question, I guess it would be, is the treatment of people with SMIs any different in private prisons versus public prisons?
Yeah, no, and I don't know the answer. That's a great question, and I need to go figure it out. I wonder if we even could get that information from the private prisons. But interesting question, and I thank you for it, and I'll research it.
Okay, and I have a question from Fred. Actually, two questions it looks like. Are any police agencies training officers to help them understand when they are dealing with person with mental illness? And the second question, in addition to developing Hope House, what else does the Greenburg Center do at present?
Sure. So yes, there are some really great examples. And in fact, on Monday, the Greenburger Center and the City of Hudson, I'm going to play both roles together. It's finally one assignment that I'll be doing work for both. We are convening the leaders in Columbia County in a private convening, the DA, the public defender, and the health directors of the health organization and others, service providers, to talk about this very thing. So we're bringing in a judge named Judge Stephen Leichman. Judge Leichman is the judge in Miami-Dade. He's the chief administrative judge for criminal matters in Miami-Dade. And he has worked for 20 years to put together a incredibly effective diversion program where they start by training the police in something called CIT, Crisis Intervention Training, so that the police who go out for EDP, emotionally disturbed person calls, are trained to de-escalate. And he has amazing statistics in terms of not only the number of deaths that have been reduced, the cost, and the increased positive outcomes. And so he's been honored by the Supreme Court and many, many others. His program is being replicated throughout the country, and we're trying to hopefully replicate that or some version of it in Columbia County. So absolutely there are things. And there's also something called the Stepping Up Initiative, and that's a program of the Council of State Governments, and they are promoting the CIT intervention training and a more holistic approach to redirect right at the point of intercept, when you intercept with the police, to divert people and redirect them into a respite center or into places that are non-forensic. In terms of the Greenburger Center, we have done things like forums, mostly they all have been in New York City, where we bring parties together, like we've had all the DAs at a convening. We've had various city officials to talk about different aspects of the criminal justice system as they relate to the SMI population. We also, I write op-eds from time to time in the New York Daily News and other places, trying to, address this issue and bring it to people's minds. So.
Okay, Jane Lax raised her hand.
I did.
So she's
First of all, I'd just like to make a statement, because this is kind of unusual for me. I just think it's extraordinarily commendable that you were once a judge and that you're actually doing this work. And I think that's amazing. And it's usually I really want to know what people know. And in this case, I really want to understand your journey. So I just recognize that, and that is just so amazing. And thank you for doing this work.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
So I have like 3 really different questions. I don't have to ask all of them. The first one I have is the Hope House based on some evidence-based treatment model, or are you breaking new ground? Are there other similar programs that you're basing this on?
Great question. And we have an amazing board of advisors that advise us on all aspects of Hope House. And so this program is actually based on 2 evidence-based programs that have been in operation for 50 years. One is this modified therapeutic community model that is implemented by an organization called Argus Community. Argus Community has operated for 50 years now, mostly with substance use disorder people, but people that also have mental illness. They operate several facilities throughout the city, and they have a great success rate on people that other programs have given up on. So they're kind of the last stop, and they're actually the only facility that was willing to take Morgan Greenburger. So that's why we developed this great relationship with them. And once we do open, excuse me, they will be partnering with us to run the residential piece of it and the clinical piece of it. So we're not doing this. We are more the social innovator. We're not the provider. The other organization we looked to was something called Fountain House in New York City. Fountain House, actually when there was a deinstitutionalization, members people who were deinstitutionalized got together with their families and they started this clubhouse model, and they became members. They're called members of the clubhouse. And it's been amazing how the peer support with support from therapy and psychiatry has allowed this model and this community to grow. It's now international. The clubhouse model originated in New York City, and they have the clubhouse, which is one building where they have a work order day. So there are 4 areas where they concentrate on: cooking, job preparedness, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on the other 2, but they all revolve around a work order day. So for example, lunch doesn't get put on the table unless the members come in and help the staff make this lunch. So they're all very invested in how the whole clubhouse works. The clubhouse is connected to supported and supportive housing. You can also live on your own, but they have a huge network of apartments that are in some sense managed or associated with the clubhouse. So we are going to have a program that's a modified therapeutic community with a work order day overlay. So people in our facility will be, I don't want to say program, but in a good way. They'll have things to do from the time they get up till the time they go to bed. There'll certainly be some downtime, but lunch won't get made unless everyone in Hope House helps make the lunch.
Cool. So, well, this would be, well, what you have in front of you is auspicious enough. But obviously the need for this is really tremendous. And are there other plans for, kind of either opening other facilities in other parts of New York City, other parts of New York State, or maybe working with other organizations to kind of put this model in place in other places of need?
We'd love to do that. And 6 years ago, if you would have asked me that question, I would have thought, in 6 years, there'll be Hope Houses everywhere. And I'm a fan of government. I actually, I work right now for the City of Hudson. I have always worked for government or nonprofit. And I'm a real fan, but I want to rip my hair out on this project. It's taken so long that I hope so. I hope we're going to expand. That's the goal. And in some sense, I'm trying to I'd love to have this model work out in Columbia County as well. And actually, we'll take a more regional approach. There isn't the population upstate, but there's the need. So in New York City, you have half the population that's in prison is actually originating from New York City. But up here, I could see this model hopefully working as part of an integrated system with a couple of other, maybe Albany, Columbia, Green. I can see a regional approach. I hope that's what happens up here.
Okay. How about I let somebody else ask a question?
Okay, great. I have a couple questions more for you. Actually, a couple questions now that are not related to the topic, but sort of in your areas of expertise and knowledge. Elizabeth asked, how is it that people are incarcerated on drug-related offenses and drugs are readily available in the prisons?
Yeah, no, that's a good, I agree with you. It's ironic, and I can't say who, but I know firsthand that people that have been incarcerated, even in solitary confinement, were able to get drugs, and the strong suspicion was they came from employees of the prison. So I can't confirm that myself. It's what I was told by someone that I know personally who was incarcerated. So it's very ironic, and it's we need to have a wholesale shift in our drug policies in this country.
Okay, and now another question that's unrelated but of general interest. Since you talked about your working heavily getting involved with the City of Hudson, their government, and Andy asked, since the City of Hudson was or is heavily influenced with minorities recently and an influx of outsiders, does this mean Hudson has a gentrification problem?
Well, Hudson has had a gentrification problem, or opportunity, I would say, for the 20 years that I've been here. I think there's a lot of pressure on the lower income neighborhoods, and there needs to be, and I think there will be a coming together. I hope with Mayor Johnson in office that he's working hard to bridge the gap and to have Hudson grow in a way that it meets everyone's needs. Otherwise, I think, yeah, it's happened time and time and again in many other communities that gentrification comes in and pushes out people who can no longer afford rents. We're working very hard with housing providers to provide low income and moderate income and workforce housing in Hudson so that we can maintain the diversity that I think most people in Hudson really appreciate and want to keep. We're struggling to try and find out how to do that, but I have every confidence that Mayor Johnson will figure this one out.
Okay, great. Lisa Clements has a question about, back to the topic, would a federal program make more sense than state efforts? And is this something should Biden put mental health in his platform?
Oh, absolutely. I think he should. And it's always been kind of a state federal problem. Medicaid, taking care of people with mental illness. It's over the years, it's ping ponged from the federal government to the states. And we need to have a holistic approach where the state and federal government are working together, not at odds. It's almost like, Dorothea Dix was actually a leader in the 1800s on trying to get people into basically federal and state psychiatric facilities. At that time, she took a tour of the United States and saw people, chained to hitching posts out in the backyard. In barns. It was horrific. And the federal government took a lot of that over and then, gave it back to the states. So there's always been this kind of ping pong and it's not serving anyone. So we need to, Biden could show real leadership on this issue.
Okay. I don't have any more written questions and comments, but Jane, you still had something else you wanted to ask. I heard two of your three.
Yes, no, I could ask questions all day on this topic. So, you talk about having kind of the comprehensive thing, and what you're doing is amazing because we really need to keep mentally ill people from being incarcerated, and I would say wrongly. But the source of the problem is that we really don't have an ethic in our culture with regard to early treatment and integration into society. And is there any work currently in the works? Is this something you all are looking at too, to get them before they become incarcerated? And I know that there's a lot of challenges with regard to, medication and treatment, et cetera, especially when people become autonomous adults and they can refuse those things. And just context, I had a mentally ill mom. So this is not, she was never incarcerated and there was never danger in that. But, there are some really huge problems. So I just wondered if there was any vision on that aspect of it, and you're doing enough.
No, there's always more to do. And I appreciate it. There are some things, well, like I mentioned, the Stepping Up initiative and what's happening in Florida. There's also a successful program in San Antonio where the whole goal is really to, at that intercept, that first connection with the criminal justice system, to just divert people, not even take them to the jail to get booked, but to take them to a respite center where there's no charge issued. They're just given over to the respite center where there's a triage of professionals who can deal with mental illness crisis or substance use disorder. And I think that's a great start. But I think your question goes to, well, isn't there something before that? Do we need to wait till there's a crisis like we do now before someone gets help? And you're absolutely right. We need to address it in a more holistic way. I think we need to understand that there are people that are not having a passing bad day. There are people that have serious mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar. And when it shows itself when they're young adults, we need to be better at recognizing that and not necessarily just, either expelling them or saying it's okay, don't worry about it, or, you'll get over it. That's the time when it's shown that these diseases can be most effectively dealt with at first break, at first episode. that's the time we have to get in there and really do something to avoid this criminalization of mental illness. Plus, we have to have the infrastructure in place. So when there is a break, when there is something, that families like you can do something. The people, besides people in the Bronx who have impressed me most, are the family members that I've met over the last 6 years. They, especially the mothers, they are like tigers about their children, and rightly so. And they've been pushing for reforms all over the country. So yeah, and if anyone, on the call ever wants to be connected with some of these amazing women across the country, I'm happy, and you have a personal, issue, happy to do so, and they'll get you connected to all the networks that have formed because of the gaps.
So on the lines of, the industrial complex, and really, actually, I think the mass incarceration, even for states like New York, are supporting whole economies and communities. And I think one of the challenges of reform is when you're looking at like shutting down a jail or changing how we do the prison system, is that people are going to be out of jobs and economies will collapse, which is insane that we have economies built on criminalization. How, from a boots on the ground perspective, and again, you're doing enough, thank you. What can we do to kind of help shift this? What does our country need to do to help shift this? And, once, if we can solve this problem, what do we do with all the people who've been incarcerated since early adulthood? And, so maybe we release them, and I know there's programs where people try to do the integration and stuff, but it's huge. It's so big. It just gets so overwhelming to think about.
It is, overwhelming at times, but there are amazing organizations that are, many of my colleagues that I work with in New York City have incredible programs that help with reentry, citizens who are returning home. The problem is, my experience in the legal system and in the criminal justice system is that there are two different worlds. There's downstate and upstate. And upstate, we really need to figure out some creative solutions and some regional working relationships and networking, because we don't have the resources that they do downstate, but we have all the same problems. Hudson has all the same problems of a big city, but we only have 6,000 people to pay the tax base. And,
right.
It's a challenge. So we have to come up with, I think, regional solutions for some of this. And the question you had in the beginning, I'm sorry, you had another.
Well, it's just more tackling this because, there's the reentry issue, there's the economics, and I get from a policy perspective, this is abominable, criminal as far as I'm concerned. Just how do we get there? How do we even start to get there?
Right. I wanted to mention, you said the economy and the jails closing and shrinking. Albany actually just did something about 6 months ago or so. They found that their jail was shrinking. Their jail population was shrinking, and it really had to do with bail reform and other issues. But bail reform was a big one. And so they actually took a wing of their jail and they made it into homeless housing for people coming out of the jail. So they took off the cell doors, they put on real doors, they had a bathroom in each kind of room, and it's now staffed by nonprofits and civil employees, from what I understand, not correctional officers, but civil employees of the county. And that's important, because the most vulnerable time of someone coming out is right in the beginning. And it's when a lot of them don't have any place to go. Right. Some of them may not be able to go into the public housing because there's requirements or restrictions if you have a criminal record going into public housing. Others, if facilities get some forms of federal funding, the federal government requires that the person has to be chronically homeless, which means, I want to say either 9 months or some amount of time to be chronically homeless before you can get homeless housing. It's crazy. So, and of course, it's the very, most important critical time for someone. So what Albany did was to, have someone come out one door and go in another, but in a very different way, from what I understand. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen it, but I think, I'm not sure how well it's working, But I think we have to be creative. We have to start reusing and reprogramming, repurposing this infrastructure for good.
Mhm.
And with that, maybe retraining people.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, I don't see any more questions from anyone. If anybody else has questions, please raise your hand or type it in. I would like to thank you again, Cheryl, for everything, for taking time to talk to us today. It's been very instructive. I think we all learned a lot, and I guess we need to do one more shameless plug for the greenburgercenter.org.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it very much. I appreciate your questions. I learned something. I have some work to do to go and research a couple questions I couldn't answer. So thank you so much. And yes, please feel free to sign up for the Greenburger Center's newsletter. I would love to hear more from you. So thank you so much. It's been an honor.